Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
So in the first half of the semesters, we look at the financial accounting issues, the accounting systems, and also some of the public administration issues like marketizations or public-private partnerships. Right. So today we look at a different topic, which is increasingly important, right, for the public sector, which is the performance measurement issues. So performance measurement and also external reporting, these two topics. They're big issues in the public sectors, right? So there we have a look at what are these issues involved. Okay. So for the reading for this topic, the first one is an ANAO report. Now this report provides a summary of the developments of the Commonwealth Performance Measurement Framework over time, and it's also given evaluations of the key performance indicators developed by the Commonwealth agencies, right? So quite interesting. The second reading is an inquiry by JCPAA into the recent Commonwealth Performance Framework. There was a new framework developed and implemented since 2015. So this inquiry look into this framework. And it provides some background information about the new framework and also some evaluations of some of the issues involved as well. Okay. The third article it provides a summaries of the performance information issues, particularly linked to accountability, and also some discuss the types of performance information which is relevant for assessments of meeting the organizational objectives and for reporting purposes. Okay, the last one is also an interesting article looking at the performance measurements over the 40 years on, right? So it's actually examines some of the issues and challenges in developing appropriate performance measurements, okay, in the public sector. There are other references, right, if you're interested, and have a look at that. Okay, so what we'll look at for today, first of all, we look at what do we mean by performance, right, in the public sectors, what is the rationale for performance measurements, and why we need performance informations. Okay, and then we look at some of the key performance measurement concepts, right, in the public sector, and also the developments of the performance informations. Okay, and finally, we look at some of the issues and challenges, right, in performance information. Okay. Now, first of all, before we look at the concepts, if I ask you, what do we mean by performance? What do you think? Say, in the private sector, what comes to your mind about performance? Sorry, yeah. Revenue, it's okay. So there's financial performance. Any others?
Eligible?
Yes, eligible. Yeah. Could you explain a bit more about what? You're talking about private or public sector? The public sector, okay. So where they perform the duty or objectives, and okay, so that's good. Yeah, any others? Yeah, so that will be in the private sectors, right? So okay, so the market performance, that's good, right? And okay, so you can see some there in the private sectors, we probably focus more on financial performance, right? Because the private sector, they're more answerable to the shareholders, right? Although there might be some move towards social, environmental concepts, okay? But in the public sectors, I think they sort of come across some of the performance concept, right, in the previous topics. Like, we're looking at efficiency, effectiveness, right? So these are generally some the performance concept in the public sector. So if we look at the slides, right? So in the private sectors, right, I think everyone is very familiar with it, right? So we look at profitability, liquidities, market shares, etc., right? But for the public sectors, we look at efficiency, effectiveness, or outcomes, etc. So the concept, they are very different, okay? And I take a quote from one of the reading, right? So this is quite a recent one. So it says in the public sector context, performance is obviously multi-dimensional, right, in the public sector. So a good performance, right, could refer to cost, efficiency, right? So some more on the costs, it would be on the financial side, right? Efficiencies can be financial or non-financial, yeah. Effectiveness, freedom from corruptions, public access, right? Qualities of services, or a host of other dimensions, right? So it's multi-dimensional and it encompasses both financial and non-financial aspects, right? So we will come back to the concepts again in terms of how to measure them. Okay. All right. So this is another quote, right? Take it out from ANAO's Better Practice Guide, right, on public sector governance. And it says that most public sector entities receive public funding, right, to achieve outcomes for government, okay, through the deliveries of program services under their charters. So you can see the operations is quite different, right, for public sectors as compared to the private sectors. So the public sector, they receive public fundings, right, mainly from taxation revenues, and the purpose is to achieve the outcomes, right, the policy outcome, right, and through the deliveries of programs and services, okay. And in this context, good governance generally focus on two key requirements of public sector entities, right, that include performance and accountabilities. And good governance consider both performance and accountability within a rich management framework, right, rather than trading one off against the others. Now, the public sector concept is also extended to governance as well in recent years, right? So so good governance is also part of the achieving good performance, right? Integral part of achieving good performance. Okay, so you talk about two dimensions here, right? So one is the performance, and the other is accountabilities. Okay, so we know these are all very important, but what is the role of performance information, right, in achieving performance and accountabilities, right? So if we say, if I draw a diagram here, right? So hope you can see it. So this is performance informations, right? So how performance informations can reflect performance? Okay. So of course, if you think about some of the performance information, do you have any example in mind about performance information? Non-financial type or information? Any idea? Any examples that you have come across in the previous topic? Or maybe anyone? Wanda?
Maybe like sentiment statistics, how campaigns helped people that you've now.
That's good. All right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So maybe some of the data. All right. Yeah. About. Okay. That's good. All right. Funding. Right. And in addition to that, right. So the probably more important. Right. So we look at the results of the operations or program. Okay. Okay, so this is the funding size, and this is how the government achieve maybe the outcomes and things like that, right? So for the government, they normally require these types of informations, right? So for these informations normally reflects the government performance, right? Particularly if we look at the result, right? The result of the operations of the program, and this will help to reflect the performance, and the government can make use of these informations to evaluate any area that require improvement right? So this is for management and of the performance. Now, once these results or the informations are communicated to the public, that means you make it visible to the public, right? We call it visibility of the information, okay, to stakeholders. Okay, and this normally is through monitoring and reporting, okay? Okay, so through monitoring or reporting, the government make the information visible, right, to the stakeholders. And in that case, it helps to achieve accountabilities or public accountability, okay? Of course, these are interrelated, not one another, right? Because once the government achieves good performance, and when it communicates, right, it's also achieve accountabilities as well, right? So that's part of the ideas, right, about the role of performance information, right? So where does it sit, right? So you can see how important performance information is, right, for performance and accountabilities, okay? And so this one, we just talk about that, right? So supplements what we have looked at just now. Performance information informs entity and government, right, about the performance of the program, right? So all these, okay? Including the impacts and cost effectiveness, right? And signal opportunity for improvement, right? So once they will help to improve government performance, okay? So what drive the increasing attention to the needs for performance informations? We talk about public sector reform, right, in early 1990s, and also until recently, there is a Commonwealth public management reforms as well. And so these reforms, they put pressures on for greater government accountabilities and also greater pressures for accountability for results, right? So not only just accountable for the process, right, or not just accountable for the input for funding, but also for the results, right? So it's quite result-focused. And so performance information is needed, right, to evaluate the efficiencies and effectiveness of government operations, right? So performance information is considered as a mechanism or accountability mechanisms, okay, when the managers are given more managerial autonomy, right? Particularly under the new public management, there are delegations or devolutions of decision-making authority. So managers are given more autonomy for decision-making. And so they have to be accountable for their actions. And so performance information is getting more and more important, right, or attracting more attention. The accountability is not just for the minister, right, and the parliament, but also for the general public, okay? And in particular, for the parliaments, right, you can scrutinize public fundings in order to achieve accountability. So I think funding and the results they are closely related, right? So based on what has been achieved, the government might evaluate whether the fundings are properly used or not, okay? Okay, so the parliament would require timely information for that as well. Okay, so this is for public accountabilities. Okay, and information is also required for internal management as well. Right. So it's particularly important for department planning and also the governance. Okay, so some of the needs for performance information, such as it can help to improve the program management, decision making, right? It provides feedback, right, for planning and budgeting process, and it clarify objectives, proper resource allocations, and it facilitate identifications of outcomes, monitoring, and use of resources. Right, so you can see performance information can facilitate an integrated approach, right, of planning and looking at resource allocations and feedback, etc. Right? So it helps the managers to focus attentions on whether resources are properly allocated or any factors that might influence their resource allocation, any factors that might influence their delivery of services, right? And this also provides feedback, right, on whether the resources are directed towards achievements of the outcomes or not, okay? So it's an integrated approach of planning, resource allocation, feedback, and achievements of outcome. All right. Okay. And for individual manager, of course, this also provide incentive for them, right, to achieve their operation target. We always say, what gets measured gets done, right? Okay. So this one, this quotes probably summarize what we have talked about. Right? So good quality performance informations can be used to judge the efficiencies of process, effectiveness, and delivery, and overall impacts, right, of activities. Okay, help managers to administer program and activities more effectively. Decision maker can judge whether money is spent in the right way and right places and at high levels, etc. All right. So the ideas here is all tied back to accountability, actually. Right. So you can see some here. Information is for judging efficiency, effectiveness. Right. So these are all part of accountabilities, or to judge whether money is spent. All right. So the property, whether money is spent in the right way or more efficient, etc. Right, and also the impact, right, impact on the quality of life, right, of the program, impact of the program. So this all relate back to accountabilities. Okay. All right, so we have looked at the importance of performance informations and what drive the increasing attentions on performance informations. Now let's look at some of the key concepts here. You're probably very familiar with all these concepts by now. Right. So if economy, efficiency, effectiveness, outcomes, and output and input. Now let's go back to look at the diagram that we look at, I think, in early topic, right, when we look at accountability. So just some recaps of what we have learned about all these concepts. Right. So let's look at economy, efficiencies, and effectiveness. In the public sectors, we always call it 3 E's. 3 E's, right? Economy, efficiencies, and effectiveness. And sometimes people may have 4 E's or 5 E's, so including equities as well. All right. Okay. So economy is basically to avoid any wastage. Okay. So it's related to the input. Efficiency, look at the relationship between inputs and outputs produced. So it can be a measure of process or a measures of process or productivities. Okay, and you can, and effectiveness is the output leading to the achievements of policy outcome. So effectiveness normally is just a measure of whether the objectives are achieved or not. Okay. So very often it relates back to the outputs and also relates to the outcome. Right. So if we look at all these concepts, they are not isolated one another. They are interrelated. Right. So improvement in economy and efficiency normally will lead to improvement in effectiveness. Okay. And if the governments want to achieve efficiency, they should not achieve that at the expense of the effectiveness. Okay, so these concepts are related, and of course, outcome and output can be related to effectiveness, and output can be related back to efficiencies. Okay, and similarly for input is more related to economies. Right. So the input can be just any resources. Output represents the delivery, right? The goods and services delivered by the governments, and outcomes represents the impact impacts or consequences as a result of government's program or government policies, right? And the focus of outcomes normally is what has been changed, right? So if the government implement particular program, are there any change, right, to the society, any change to the community, right? So that is the outcome and the consequences. Okay. So the performance measurements normally are developed around these concepts. Okay. So the government will develop any performance measures to measure, say for example, efficiency, effectiveness, to measure outcome, to measure output, right? So we will look at some of the measurements, right, for these concepts. Okay. Now, before we look at the actual measures, let's look at the performance measurement framework. Right. Why performance measurement framework is important? Because the framework is a guide to develop a proper performance measurements and indicators. Okay, so performance measurement framework is generally used, right, to identify and develop relevant indicators. Right, so based on which service provisions and program can be evaluated. Right, and the framework is also a guide, right, to develop more consistent and relevant performance indicators, right, and performance informations. Right. Now there are various performance framework over time. Now, let me show you some of the framework. Now, this diagram, I take it out from ANAO's document back to 1990s. All right, so that is quite early, right? When the government starts to develop performance measurements in a more structured way. So you can see this is quite comprehensive actually. Yeah, we start look with the government policy decisions, right? So the government formulate their policy, and once they formulate policies, right, they also setting the objectives that is appropriate to the policy. And then once the objectives are set, right, it has to be say whether it's delivered through program, right? So when it's delivered through programs, you have to decide on the input, right, process and output, right, of the program, and all these will provide deliveries of goods and services to the client, right? Okay, the client can be the citizens, and then evaluate the outcomes, right, of the program, outcomes or the impacts, right, of the program. So how the performance information can be developed based on that, right? So there are indicators can be developed to evaluate whether the objectives are appropriate or not, right? So whether it's appropriate to the government policy, right? So there is no if the objective is not appropriate, right, then there's no point of delivering particular program, right? So they has to be consistent. If we look at the input and output, right, it measures efficiency. So efficiency indicators has to be based on inputs and output. We already know about that. Comparing the input and the outcome, right? So the government can develop cost effectiveness indicators. Okay. And if the government compare the outcome to the actual objectives, then it can measure the effectiveness of the outcome. Okay. So in order to measure the effectiveness of the outcome, it has to compare back to the objectives. Okay. So in this way, the appropriate performance measures, indicators or informations can be developed based on that, right? Okay. Depending on whether the government want to evaluate efficiencies, cost effectiveness, or policy effectiveness, objective effectiveness. Okay. This diagram, right, is also quite comprehensive. Can you see it? Maybe I make it bigger. I think it's taken out from the productivities report, the Productivity Commission's report. Productivity Commissions, it provide annual report on the government performance. Okay, so you can easily search these Productivity Commission reports. So it has a general performance indicator framework, and this framework, of course, it has to link to the objectives of the government, right, and its performance, right, and it identify 3 areas: equity, effectiveness, and efficiencies, and it drop economies, right? Probably it's like equity, effectiveness, and efficiencies is more important for governments. And equities is also linked to access, right? Okay, so you can measure or develop some access indicator, equities of access, right, or indicators. Effectiveness, and it can develop any access, appropriateness, or quality indicators, okay? And efficiencies can develop any technical efficiency indicators, right? So these are measures of the output, okay? And the output has to be linked to the outcome, right? So if the output does not deliver the outcome against the output is not appropriate, okay? Some of the example, the report also provide examples, right, on this kind of relationship. So one of the examples here is the improved education outcome for all young Australians, right? So this is the service objectives. And how to do that, right? So one of the area is through the school educations. So for the school education, you require input, so that include the labor and capital inputs, right? So it can be teachers, okay, or classroom, etc. And the process, right? Process can be, I don't know, the teaching process, the curriculum, the content, yeah. And the output can be the students' attendance, okay? And outcome would be the student outcome, right? Whether the students have attained certain level of knowledge, etc., right? Or whether the employability of students, etc., right? So that particular outcome. So when measuring the input and output, or the attendance, or the resources versus the attendance, you can measure the technical efficiencies, and comparing the input and outcome, it measures cost effectiveness. And if you compare the service objectives and the outcome, it measures the program effectiveness, right? So this is based on the concepts that we have looked at just now, right? The ANAO as well as the Productivity Commission's concept. Another, maybe this one, another example here, right? So look at, that was back to some years ago. Say, for example, the objective is to reduce the loss of life, right, due to fire. Okay, so this is a fire services, okay? So the input with the labor and capital, right, the firemen and equipment, etc. The process, putting out the fire. And output can be the fire incidents attended to, okay? The outcomes, the number of lives lost, right, due to fire. So that would be the outcome. Now, it also recognizes that there might be some external factors that are outside the control of the department that might affect the outcome, right? Say in this case, right, the fire services, the weather can be an external factor that might affect the outcome, right? So normally information can be developed, right, based on all this framework, but there could be some factors outside the control of the department. Okay. All right, so we can see these frameworks are quite useful. Right, so let's look at this one, right? A bit different. Now remember, we talk about the new public management, right? For the new public management, the government focus very much on accountability for result, all right? So they focus more on the output and the outcome and the result, rather than on the input and the process. So since 2000, the government introduced the outcomes and output framework, right, for budget allocations as well as for reporting purposes. Right. So that include the formulations of outcome and also formulations of the outputs. Right? So the output for, say, for an agency or for a department, it can have multiple output, right? Say, if it is a community services, right, it can be, the outputs can be, I don't know, some child care support or funding for family support, etc. Right? So there can be different types of output, and each output can have any other sub-output, right? So they need to develop a structures of, say, for community services would be the community, right? So would be the outcome. Okay, so the community group, say, if it is the family support, okay, so under family support, what are they, right? So maybe financial support, right, or other employment support, and things like that, okay? So there can be some sub-output. And there are also administered items, right? So those are not directly related to the departments, but they administer on behalf of other agencies, okay? Now, the outcomes and output framework was introduced in 2000s, and since then there were a number of problems that involved. We have discussed some of this before because it's so difficult to specify outcomes and difficult to measure output and outcome. The government wants to use this framework for allocations of resources, but the output structure is not really aligned with the actual operations of the agency. Agencies and departments, they normally operate based on programs rather than output, right? So in that case, it makes it difficult for the department to really measure output, right? Because how can the department align the output back to the program, right? So that is a challenge. And because there are problems with measuring output, it means that there is problem with budget allocations because it's hard to put a dollar value onto the output if they don't know how to measure them. Okay? So because of all this problem, in 2009, this outcomes and output framework is replaced by another framework. Right? It's called Outcomes and Programs Framework. So this is, I take it out from the Department of Finance document. So outcome is important, right? So it's department agencies, they still have to retain the outcome statement. But these outcome statements, they normally will discuss with Department of Finance and negotiate with the outcome statement. And under the outcome statements is various programs, right? So this is more in line with the government operations, right? Because but it's not based on programs. And under each program, the government have to identify their deliverables, right? Basically, what are the services they will deliver, okay? And also develop performance indicators to measure the deliverables, right? And to measure the performance of the programs, okay? So they have to identify the performance indicators, right? And then report it back to parliaments. Okay? And so this outcomes and program framework is used for budget allocation purposes as well as for annual report purposes. Okay? So until it's used until 2015. Okay? From 2015, this outcome and program framework is still being used for budget allocations, right? But the reporting side is a bit different, okay? So let's look at what happens, right? The government consider that there's still shortcomings with performance measurement. There's still some problems with developing performance informations, and the government wants to actually improve the performance information development. So they start to look at another framework, all right? So one of these is like this, right? So this is the new framework. It's the Enhanced Commonwealth Performance Framework. And at that time is discussion stage, right, 2014. And it's actually implemented in 2015, okay? So the framework includes input, output, outcome, and they link it back to government policies and program objectives, etc. Right? So you can see something. You go back to the early stage, right? Because they realize that it's not just outcomes and output. It's not just results, right? All these inputs, and process and outputs, they are also very important, right, to assess the government performance. Okay, so you can see that. Go back to the early days. Inputs can represent the resources employed, right? Output, right, represents products, right, and their intended recipient. Now, outcomes has been a very difficult area to measure, right, because they are very long term, and the government actually suggests the use of short term outcomes, medium term outcome, and longer term outcome, right, to help to develop outcome informations. Okay. All right. And so this is the new Commonwealth Performance Framework. At the moment, since 2015, right, until now, the government used this performance framework. So it includes some 3 documents, right? The portfolio budget statements, the corporate plan, and the annual report. And within the annual report, there is an annual performance statement. So this is the portfolio budget statement is about the budget, all right? About the budget. So it's about the funding, right? So we'll come back to here, right? So about the funding. And they introduce corporate plan, all right? The corporate plan is about the planning by the agencies, and annual performance statement is the reporting of the result, right? So it's basically come back to here, right? So if we fit into this area, right? So the funding will be related to the portfolio budget statements, right? The result here probably would be the planning, right, including the process as well, and then the reporting, the annual performance statement is the reporting of the result. Now, we will look at these documents in detail next week, right? And for this week, we focus on the developments and the issues relating to the performance indicators and the measurements, okay? So we focus on measurement. And the reporting size, we will leave it for next week, okay? All right. So now, maybe let's come back to our slides. So I basically covered the things on the slides. So if you look at ANAO performance framework, all right, so we have looked at just now, so with all these appropriateness of the policy, we look at the measurements of efficiencies, cost effectiveness, okay, and the program effectiveness. The outcome is an output framework, right, that was prior to 2009. And so the government aims to improve the government agencies' governance and public accountabilities. And because of, as a result of the new public management, which focus on results, right, and performance. And because of the problems, issues related to outcomes and output framework, in 2009, right, is being changed to outcomes and program frameworks. Now, this outcomes and program framework is still being used currently. All right, so you can see this framework being applied to the portfolio budget statement. Okay. And since 2015, enhanced whole of government performance framework has been implemented under the Commonwealth Public Management Reform Agenda. Right? The purpose is to ensure that the public sector managers, the parliament, and the public have relevant performance information, right, to link the use of public resources and government achievement Right, so the main purpose for this reform, right, is to develop an integrated framework, right, which integrates resource management and performance management together, right? Okay. So an area of the reform, right, is to focus on improving the qualities of planning, performance informations, and evaluations, right, to improve accountability to minister, parliament, and the public, right. It also is about continuing the focus on internal process and more streamlined, risk-based, and better focus, right. So it's not just focusing on external accountability or public accountability, right. It's also focused on internal management as well, right. So the frameworks focus on linking the internal management to the planning, right, as well as to the reporting and accountabilities. Okay, and it focuses on not just the financial information, but also the non-financial information, and it's also integrate risk management, right, as a way to improve performance as well. Okay. Right. As we mentioned just now, there are 3 key documents, right? The portfolio budget statement. Portfolio budget statement is still based on the outcome and program framework. Okay. Corporate plans and annual performance statements is based on the new Commonwealth Performance Framework. Right, so we'll talk more about this next week. Okay, and just an emphasis about the link between these 3. Right, so the portfolio budget statement has to link to the corporate plan, and the corporate plan links to the annual performance statement. Right. Okay, so the 3 are linked together so that the qualities of performance measurements and reportings can be improved. Okay. Yeah. So the governments want to look at not just the objectives, right, but also how the agency plan to achieve the objectives. Right. So that is the process on how, and also what they did. Right, what they're going to do and what they did. Okay, all right. So you can see the framework not just focus on output, but also on the process as well. Okay. So we have looked at the framework, right, and we understand that performance information is an important accountability mechanism. But so far, we haven't actually defined what is performance information, right? So what is performance information? So based on previous framework, right, it defines performance information as those informations that address the relationship between input. Input would be the resources used, right? The process, what is produced, right? The process. What is being done, right? The process, what is being done, and the output is what is being produced, and the outcome is what is the achieve, whether objectives has been achieved or not. Okay, and what are the impacts? Okay, and all these input, process, and output and outcomes has to be integrated back to the policy directions and objectives. Okay. So this is more related back to the original framework, right? The ANAO framework that I showed you at the start. Okay. Now, more recently, the enhanced performance framework, right? That is the new framework. It says the performance information is data sold and generated by entity to determine the efficiency and effectiveness of their activities. Okay. And in the achievements of their purposes. And performance information supports stories that describe how public resources are used to deliver on a Commonwealth entity's purposes. And performance information may be quantitative and qualitative. Now, there are several things here, all right, in this quote. first of all, right, you talk about some efficiencies and effectiveness of activities. So that link it back to what we have talked about and the key performance, right, of the entities. And secondly, you use the term purposes, okay, and not outcomes or output, okay, although they are similar, right, but you use the term purposes. Okay, and it also focuses on quantitative and qualitative information, not just quantitative. The previous outcome, not the previous, actually, yeah, it's also currently being used, all right? The outcomes and program frameworks. For that framework, the government agencies, they have to develop key performance indicators, right? So that is more quantitative. And for the new enhanced performance framework, it also focuses on qualitative information, right? Not just the quantitatives, okay? Right. So that means the enhanced performance framework allows flexibility in performance measurement, right? So it allows the use of both qualitative as well as quantitative informations, right? So not just developing key performance indicators, but they can also use other measurement tools, right? Such as use benchmarkings, or they can use surveys to generate some of the data, or use benchmarkings, etc. Right? And some even use case studies as well. Right? So they allows a whole lot of ways of measuring performance and the use of different types of information. So there are more flexibilities, right, allowed right, under this new framework. And you focus on purposes and activities. Right? So rather than outcomes and outputs, it's focused on purposes and activities. Now, the Department of Finance guidance does not really assume that purposes and activities are equivalent to programs and output, right? Okay, so I'll put it this way. So there are outcome and program on one hand, okay? Right, and there are also purposes and activities on the other hand. Okay, so the outcomes and program are the framework for preparing portfolio budget statement. Okay, purposes and activities are related to corporate plan and annual performance statements, right? The annual report, performance statements, right? So Department of Finance, they don't consider that they are necessarily consistent, right, with one another, but it leaves it to the agency to decide how they are going to map outcome, program, and purpose and activities, right? So what do you think will be the issue here, right? Okay, so first of all, the departments and agencies, they need to match these two, okay? And second is, how can they develop performance information or indicators that will fit into different frameworks, right? So this is a challenge, right, for the entity or for the government agencies and departments, right, to develop. It has been a few years, and the ANAO has done some audit, right, in the developments of performance information in relation to the new framework. We will talk more about the results of the ANAO audit maybe next week, okay? So currently, let's just focus on some of the issues about the measurement, okay? How about we have a break and then we come back to look at some of the examples of purposes and activities, okay? let's continue with the new performance measurement framework. And look at the purposes and the activities. Right? The activities should contribute to the purpose. These are from the Department of Finance Resource Management Guide. And so it develops some guidance in terms of how information can be developed. So you look at two levels. One is the purpose level, right? And the other is the activity level. Right? In the purpose level, the agencies or the departments, they have to identify the needs, right? What are the needs, right, for the communities? I use some of the examples by Department of Finance, right? So one of the examples is that, say for regions, there might be something happen to the region, say for example, a closures of the major business. Say for example, there might be the car manufacturing closed down, all right? So it left a lot of workers unemployed, right? And the region's economic situations going downturn, etc. Right? So there is a need to help that region for economic development because of the closures of a manufacturing business. Okay, and so there is a need, and the purpose could be to help or to sustain the economic viability of that region, right? So they identify that as a purpose. And to achieve that purpose, the governments can undertake a number of activities, right? So these activities, for example, can include financial assistance, right, to the business, or employment assistance, right, to the workers, to those workers who lost their jobs and things like that. Okay. And the outcome, right, combined outcome of all these activities, it can be maintains the economic viabilities of the region, right? Okay, so that will be the outcome of the purpose and activities, right? So the purpose is to sustain the economic viabilities, and so through all these activities, right, all these assistance, the government would expect to achieve the outcomes of enhancing the economics or reviving the economic viability, right, of the regions. Okay, and so the impacts would be it can be attracting new business to the regions, etc. Right? So that make a change to the area, okay, to the region. So that is the purpose level logic, right? So it develops the purpose there. And for individual activities, there are several aspects, right, for individual activities. The government have to consider what is the contributions, right, of the activities, right? Say, for example, back to the examples about the business closures, right, in the regions, and need to help with the economic viabilities of the regions, and the contributions can be to retrain, right, those who was unemployed, right? So those who are unemployed become employed, okay? And so the activities would be to retrain them. So in order to retrain the workers to gain employment, they need certain input. For example, what can be the inputs? They need facilities, right? So they need, say, instructors, right, or trainers, etc. Right. So the government can develop indicators, right, around these inputs, right? Yeah. How many teachers or instructors, right, or qualified instructors was employed to run the training programs, etc. Or how many training programs has been run? Okay. The process can be establishing curriculums, right? Again, they can measure the curriculum, whether there are sufficient curriculums, etc. Okay, and the output will be whether those who are unemployed or those workers actually gain the skills, right? Okay, so that can be an output. Okay, so the government can develop measurements, right, based on these sorts of outputs. Say, for example, how many workers qualify for particular skills, okay, or whether the qualities of the workers, etc. Measure the qualities of the workers, etc. Okay, and the outcome, right, can be whether the trainees was re-employed or not, okay, right, or the employment level, right. So that can be an outcome. So once the governments identify the purpose, right, and identify various aspects of the activities, so the performance informations will be developed or built around all these aspects. Okay, all right. So these are the performance informations, right, based on the new performance framework. Okay. Okay, so maybe all right. Okay. So if we look at the performance indicators, there are various types of performance measurements and indicators, right? So they can be financial, right, or non-financial types of informations. They can be qualitative or quantitative measures. As we mentioned just now, the Commonwealth Performance Framework, right, they allow for flexibility, so the agencies can make use of various types of informations, right? Financial, non-financial, qualitative or quantitative measures. Now, in relation to the measures of outcomes, it's basically an effectiveness measure, right? When measuring the outcomes, the agency probably have to consider the multiple objectives of the governments, right? So the government, they normally have multiple objectives, right? Not just one objectives, and whether those objectives are realistic and measurables, etc. Right? So they have to consider all these. So we will look at some of the problems, right, with measuring outcomes in a minute. The measures of input, they're largely quantitative. For example, the cost, right? How much is the cost, right? Or the number of staff involved, right, in carrying out the activities. Processes normally relates to efficiencies, right? Or the governments can make use of the benchmarking or productivity measures, right, to measure process. Outputs, it can be quality of the outputs or quantities of the outputs. Quantity of the outputs is normally easiest to measure. I say, for example, some number of grants processed, right, or number of applications that has been processed, or number of contracts that has been administered. Okay, so that is easier to measure. Quality is a little bit difficult to measure, right? So we involve the judgment, right? Involve judgments or expectations of the customers, right, in relation to whether the goods and services delivered are of good qualities or not. Okay, so that involves a bit of judgment. Okay. And we'll look at some of the issues involved. Now, I'd like to show you some of the examples of this kind of indicators. So I take the Department of Education and Training. This is annual report, but what we look at here is basically we just look at the measures, okay, and get a feel about what kind of measures they use, and whether you think they are relevant or appropriate or not, and what might be the problems involved. Okay, let me see. First of all, how can I go go to. Now, let's have a look at the purpose, outcomes, and programs. Remember, we talk about all these outcomes, program, and purposes, right? So they have to map them together. And the purpose here is to maximizing opportunities and prosperity, right, through national leaderships on education and training, right? So that is the overarching purposes. Right? So you can see it can be very high level and quite abstractive. Let's focus on just outcome 2, right? Because there are 2 outcomes here. Let's just focus on outcome 2 with the world-class tertiary educations, training, and research. And the outcome objectives, right, is to promote growth in economic productivities and social well-being. So what do you think about this kind of outcome? Okay. I guess, for Department of Education, right, these will be relevant, but they can be quite abstractive, right, very high level, and you can see they can be very difficult to measure the growth in economic productivities, and it's quite hard to measure social well-being, right, because all these outcomes, you can see they are very long-term, right, and where can you find the data, right, to measure them? And to address this kind of problems, so the government actually suggests that the department agencies, they may consider looking at medium-term outcome or short-term outcome. So for most of the outcome statements, now you can see they use the word through whatever, all right, through whatever to achieve this high-level outcome. So in order to achieve growth in economic productivities and well-being, right, the departments can access through access to quality higher educations, right? So one of the medium-term outcome, right, would be access to high-quality educations, international educations, and international quality research skills and training, right? There are various programs under this outcome too to achieve the outcome. So you can have a few of these programs: Commonwealth Grant Scheme, Higher Education Superannuation Program, Higher Education Support, Loan Program, etc., right, and research. Now let's look at maybe one of these, right? Maybe let's look at the first 2, right? First 3, right? 2.1, maybe 2.3, right? As an example. I might go back to page. Okay. So this is program 2. Program 2.1, right, will be the Commonwealth Grant Scheme. There are some performance criteria and targets. Okay. So the targets will be all domestic students accepted into a bachelor level course, right, at a public university, right, are provided with a Commonwealth support places, right. Well, of course, the governments at the moment, they are doing this already, right? So, this probably would be relevant, right? And there are some other performance informations and targets, right? These are performance indicators. For example, the number of Commonwealth supported domestic undergraduate places. So they have a target, right? And also say result. So, and also the supported domestic postgraduate coursework places, right? So, what do you think about this kind of indicator? What types of indicator is this one? They are quantitative, first of all, right? Quantitative indicators. Do you think they are input or output indicator? Number of places for domestic students. They want all domestic students have a place, right? Okay, so can be an input, do you think? Or anyone disagree? It's hard to judge. Sometimes it's hard to judge, right? But it's only a place, right? It's not producing anything. It's only provide the place, right? So yeah, so it can be an input. Okay. Let's look at the others. There are maybe we look at other performance indicator. How about this one? The focus. This is higher education support. All right, let's look at the support. So the performance criteria will be a focus on quality and informed student choice is maintained, all right, in the higher education system. Right, so the targets will be whatever, right, 81% of undergraduate students rate the teaching quality at their institution positively. Okay, so do you think some of these measures higher education support? Well, this represents teaching quality. Okay, so you can think some they are relevant, right? And quality is important anyway, right? Providing the qualities of teaching is important. But do you think it's difficult to measure? So it's based on evaluation, student evaluation. So you all do teaching evaluation anyway, and the government also conducts their graduate survey as well. So once you graduate, right, so you will receive a survey, right, from the government about your satisfactions. Okay, so do you think this is a kind of good measure of quality of the survey? I think quality measures is relevant, but it can be quite difficult to measure, all right? And it depends on the designs of the questionnaire, right? Design of the survey, and also the reliabilities of the data. Who do they survey? So, right, how many responses are there? So yeah, so it depends on the reliabilities of the data as well. Okay. Let's look at other types of example. And how about this? The scholarship, providing scholarship support. Do you think they are relevant measure as a kind of education support? It's probably relevant, okay? Yeah, for education support, and they have a target of how many scholarships are being awarded, right? So this is, again, quantitative measure, right? And it's quite easy to administer, right? Just the number of scholarships. So probably not much controversial issue with this one. Okay. How about this one? The proportion of undergraduate employed within 4 months of the completion of degree. It's a measure of education support. I don't know. Do you think they are relevant as a measure of education support? Do you think this is an input measure or output measure or outcome measure? Or what do you think? Outcome measure, okay, whether they're employed, okay, all right, yeah. So output can be number of students graduate, yeah, yeah. So whether they are employed, yeah, can be, okay, an outcome, all right. So do you think this, is there any issue in relation to this kind of measurement? Is there any factors that might affect the employabilities of graduates that might be outside the control of the departments? Because this is part of the department's performance indicator. All right, yeah. So it can be, depends on the economic situations, right, where there are jobs available, okay? So, yeah, so when the government formulate the policies, they want graduates to complete and get a job, right? But at the same time, there's another side of the policy, right? So say economic policy, right? So the government also have to consider the economic policy, whether and how they're going to enhance employment opportunities, things like that, right? Or employment growth, etc. Right? So as to enhance, so as to achieve these objectives, right? So you can see sometimes government objectives, they depend on each other, right? Whether the government can achieve them or not. Okay, so the government have a number of policies, but many of them they are interdependent. Okay, so in that case, it can be quite difficult to measure one area, right, without considering the other area. Okay. Another measure like the number of teaching awards. Do you think it measure any what they want to measure? Is still measuring quality of teaching? Do you think that might be the case? Okay, so you can see it can be difficult, right? So there can be some of the issues involved, but for this one, I just let you have a few of some of the examples of performance indicators relating to the government departments and whether they are relevant and whether there might be some of the issues involved, right, in developing the indicators. Okay. All right. So let's come back to some of our issues here. Now, first of all, let's look at the usefulness of the outcomes, right, and output information for performance measurements. Right. So outcomes and output informations, right, conceptually they are useful, right? Of course, the government want to know about the outcome, and it is relevant, right, because the government have to be accountable to the general public or the communities. So outcomes is important, okay? And also, output is also important, right, because the government have to be accountable for what they deliver, okay? So conceptually, they are important and they are relevant, but in terms of the measurements can be problematic, right? And it's also difficult to specify the outcome, right, how specific they should be. We look at an example just now, right, about the educations to promote the I can't remember what is the social outcome, right, of the Department of Education. So they are very high level and objectives, and because they have long-term impact, right, but some of these issues can be addressed, right, through other medium-term outcome. And another issues about the outcome is whether they really reflect the policy objectives or not, okay, or whether they reflect the program objectives or not. And other things to consider is whether they are influenced by factors that might be outside control of the department. Okay. All right. So more specifically, let's look at some of the difficulties involved. Right, how to measure impact. Impact is long term. Okay, as we mentioned. So how to collect data, right, relating to impact is a problem, okay, particularly the reliabilities of data. Okay. And to address these issues, as we mentioned just now, the government suggests department and agencies to consider medium-term or short-term outcomes. Right? So that might be more measurable, right, or more realistic, right, in terms of measuring the achievements of the outcomes. Okay. Multiple objectives. Governments normally have multiple objectives, right, and even government policies, right, they have different policies, and so it's quite important for governments to consider all these multiple objectives, right. The examples we used just now, right, with the educations. We want to measure whether the students get a job, right, within 4 months of their graduations. But that also depends on the economic policy as well, right? So the education policies and economic policies can be related, right, and they depend on each other. Okay. Another example might be the energy policies and the environmental policies, right? So the government probably want to achieve reliable energy supply, but at the same time, so as to address climate change, the government want to focus more on promoting renewable energy, but renewable energy is less reliable than coal energy, right? So are there conflicting objectives, right? Or how to achieve the energy policy through better addressing the environmental policy, right? So they're all interdependent. Okay. All right. The direct relationship between the indicators and the effectiveness of specific program. The indicators has to be related to the program, right? And output has to be contribute to outcomes. Activities has to contribute to purposes, and therefore, whatever measures or indicator that has been developed, they should link to the effectiveness, right? That means, the activity measure has to link to the purpose of the program, okay? Or the outcomes of the program. This kind of direct link is quite important. Substitutions of the input, right, can affect the productivity measures. I guess if you study management accounting, that is always the case. Right? So if you substitute labor with capital, it will affect the productivity measure. So for governments, have to interpret productivity measures more carefully, particularly in case of outsourcing. So if there is outsourcing, it could appear that the productivity measures might be improved, but in fact it may not, right, because of the efficiency or the effectiveness of outsourcing program. Okay, so that has to be interpreted more carefully. The subjective nature of the quality. Quality measure is very difficult to develop. Some quality of output are more tangible and they are easier to develop. Say, for example, the timeliness, all right, of producing, say, report to minister. It can be easier to measure, okay, or reliability measures, accuracies, right? So, these are more tangible and it's easier to measure. Some are less tangible, right? For example, some customer satisfactions, right, or student satisfactions, they're more intangible, okay? And it's harder to get data for this as well. And even the government agencies, they can administer a survey, right? It can be quite costly as well. And the last one is about lack of homogeneities of functions. Many government departments, their functions may not be that homogeneous. For example, if they provide advice to the minister, right, the advice is not homogeneous, okay? So it would be harder to measure. Okay. If the government only measure the number of advice provided to minister, right, it may not be able to measure whether the response or the advice to the minister is appropriate or not, right? Because different advice, different situation, in different situations, the government has to provide different types of advice, right? So the appropriateness of advice, right, is more important than the number of advice. And the qualities of advice is more important than the number of advice. Okay. So these are some of the issues relating to developing appropriate indicator to measure outcomes and program or activities. Okay. So we have looked at the issues and what are the characteristics of good performance informations. I guess you have some ideas, right, about the characteristics, even based on financial information, right? We all know some of the relevance, reliability, comparability of information is important. Okay. In terms of the performance information or non-financial type of information, are there any characteristics of good performance measures? The Department of Finance, right, it says good performance measures will provide meaningful information on an entity's purpose, right, in terms of the effectiveness and efficiencies of activities. Focus on that purpose. So good performance information basically is they have to meet this kind of criteria, right? They need to be meaningful in terms of measuring effectiveness and efficiencies. So this is again very vague, right? And so it further provides some guidance on that. So it suggests that high quality performance information, right, should be relevant. That means it focuses on important aspects of the activities or the objectives, right? So we look at some of the indicators just now, right, for Department of Education, whether they are relevant or not, right, to measure particular programs. Okay. Reliability, right, so users have confidence in the information, right, that is reliability of the information. And again, we know getting reliable data is also difficult, particularly measuring the qualities of output, right, or measuring some long-term impact, right, is quite difficult to obtain reliable information because of the time frame. Yeah. Okay. Comparable, that is comparable across time or across similar types of activities. Now, comparability within an entity over time is easier, but comparable across entities can be difficult because many government departments or agencies, they have different purpose, different objectives, right, or different outcomes, and so comparabilities across agencies can be challenging. Okay. Useful, right, so information continues to meet the needs of its users, right, so for information to be useful, it has to meet the needs of users. Structure, so there should be a clear relationship between objectives, targets, and informations. Right? So again, this is the heart of the Commonwealth Performance Framework, right, of linking program to outcomes, linking activities to the purposes. Okay. Proportional, so you look at the cost and efforts in collecting the information with proportional to the issues addressed. So that is a cost and benefit issues, right? So if the government want to collect customer satisfactions or client satisfactions, would it be too costly to use survey? Right? If it is too costly, is there any other method that they can use? Okay. All right. The relevance of performance information for internal and external use, and there is also argument says the information for internal purpose and external use should be consistent, right? Because that will help to enhance government accountability. Okay, so what the government use to measure their operations, right, should also be reported to the public or to the parliament, right? So that reflect what the government has actually been doing. Audits of the performance indicators. Now, not many states has done the audits of performance indicators. So Commonwealth governments audit performance indicators. I know Western Australia audit performance indicators, but not every state do that. Right? So the audit is to ensure the relevant reliability, verifiabilities of the performance informations. Now, I take out some of the report of indicators, okay, performance indicators. So the JCPA in 2014, right, so it produced a report inquiry into the PGPA Act, right, 2013. And one of the areas you look at is the performance indicators, So what it observed is that some poor performance indicators and related management practices were highlighted in 2006-07 in the NAO report. Right, so that is quite early stage, right, in 2006 and 2007, under the old outcomes and output framework. And it says the committee and ANAO have continued their focus on performance indicators and have continued to find poor results. Right? So over time, the agencies and departments, they continue to have problems developing appropriate performance indicators. Okay. And this is 2014 in one of the readings. The agencies have difficulties developing KPIs that measures the impact or effectiveness of a program, right? Contributions to achieving government outcomes. Agencies identify the most readily available performance information cover either activities or processes, okay, or the quantities of outputs, but not the effectiveness of KPIs, right? So ANAO further identify areas where there are shortcomings, right? So they discovered that agencies, they can develop indicators for processes or quantities of output, but they have difficulty in developing effectiveness KPIs, right? So as we mentioned just now, effectiveness KPI is quite difficult to measure, right? Particularly when you have to measure the impacts and effectiveness. So the one that is, it continues to be a problem, right? Until now, it's still a problem of how to measure impacts, how to measure effectiveness. It's still an issue. I want to show you another example, which is now these are the criteria used by ANAO in auditing KPIs. Right? So it's quite similar to the Department of Finance criteria. So you look at the relevance, right? So it divides into the focus, right? So that means address a significant aspect. So this is the same as the finance criteria. Understandable, okay? So information has to be quite clear. Reliable, that is measurable, right? It should be quantifiable, and free from bias, okay? And complete. It means there should be a balanced set of KPIs, right? And also some collective, right? The set of KPIs should be representatives of the program objective. Right? Okay. I will skip this one. And this one, it shows a number of departments and agencies. And the ANAO found that there is a diverse number of KPIs being developed across different departments and agencies. So, for example, if your department of, so this one, Defense Material Organizations, it has only one outcomes, but how many KPIs have they developed? 596. How can they develop so many KPIs, right? Are they really all relevant? Okay. And health, Department of Health, 126, right, across 14 outcome, 41 programs. Right, so you can see that is quite diverse. Right, some only have 11 KPI and some have hundreds. Okay. This is another example. I take it out from another ANAO report, right, 2017, and relates to Department of Human Services. Okay, so the Department of Human Services has a number of programs, right? So one of which is the Financial Information Service, and this service was established in 1989, administered by the departments, and the objectives is to assist individual. Is that okay? Do you want me to make it back up? Right. To assist individuals and broader communities to make informed decisions about their current and future financial needs. Right. So this is financial information services provided to the communities to help them to make decisions about their financial needs, okay? And to encourage them to maximize their overall income, right, by looking beyond the payments and services offered by the department, okay? So a number of services was delivered through this program. So they deliver they have telephone calls, interviews, seminar, etc., right? And the performance measures. Now, human services has only one performance measures. Right? That is relating to the seminar attendance. Okay, so related to this one. And they have two targets. One target is 56,000 attendance at seminars per annum. And the other one is 50% of the target number of seminar attendees are under the age of 55. Right, so that means they target half of these, 28,000, to be under the age of 55. Right? Okay, so what did ANAO found? Right, so this is the table. So the overall attendance, right, for the last 3 years, it seems they have achieved the target. Attendees under age of 55, this year they achieved the target. Right, the target has to be 28,000, and 2013, 2014 is under the target. Right, so they don't meet the target. So the ANAO conclude that the human services has consistently exceeded its targets for overall attendance, but has not met its internal targets relating to the number of seminar attendees under 55. And if you look at the criteria, right, if you map against the criteria, so the relevance, to say yes, all right, so some of the measures are relevant. How about reliabilities? We say partially, right? Why is partially? Because the measure is quantifiable, right? And so the performance can be tracked over time, so that is reliable. However, the process used by human services for estimating the number of seminar attendees under the age of 55 is not reliable. Okay, so why is not reliable? So we look at the note A here. I make it bigger for you. For the note A here. So how do they count number of attendees under the age of 55? So the data is sourced from an officer estimations of the age based on their physical appearance. So it's not reliable. Okay, so yeah. How can we do that? We don't know. Okay, so in terms of complete, it's no, right? Because the measures does not measure outcome against its objectives, and there is no measure relating to other services such as interviews and telephone services. Right? Just now, we say there are different types of services, but they only measure the seminar, but not the others. And there is no measures relating to retirees. Okay. Right. So you can see from this audit, there's still problems, right, relating to developing relevance, reliables, and complete performance informations. All right. Okay, so let's look at the. Oh, sorry. So because of all these problems, right, so the ANAO report, I recommended, well, much has been written on the importance of KPIs to inform the assessments of program performance. Making a difference requires leadership, effective governance, and a desire to understand the impacts of government programs and how even better outcomes may be achieved. Right? Because over time, there has always been problem, right, in terms of developing performance indicators. So to achieve better performance information or to enhance the qualities, they suggested something has to do with governance, effective leadership, and they need to commit, right, to understand the impacts of the program. So enhancing the governance, right, might be able to enhance the public trust, right, in the qualities of the government performance informations, right? Okay, so that is something that the governments also focus on, and they try to link governance to the performance as well. Right. Okay, so that's all for today, and next week we will continue to look at the performance issues, but we will focus on the reporting side. Okay, right. So see you next week.